Well, good morning, Heights family. How you guys doing? I hope you do better when Gary's preaching. I'm gonna try that one again. Let me ask you a different question. You guys glad to be here? Awesome. Well, I'm so honored to be here. I wanna say thank you to Trace for the invitation. My wife and I, we love Trace and Rachel. We've known them for quite some time, and I'm just so proud of the work that he's doing here. Heights Church, know that you are blessed to have Trace leading your student ministry. It's been a blessing for me as well to lead with Portraits. Roy grew up in the student ministry that I was a student pastor of, and anytime I have the opportunity to serve with him, it's just a full circle opportunity for me to be reminded of the faithfulness of God. I also want to say that you have an amazing staff, of course, Trace and Madison, the whole student ministry team. Students, y'all give it up for your student ministry staff. They're so great. From volunteers to the other members of your staff that I've met, Matt and Richard, just been amazing hosts. And of course, I want to extend a special thank you to Gary for sharing the teaching platform with me today. It's a high honor, and so I do not take that lightly. You are blessed to have a man like Gary Singleton as your pastor. Amen? Amen. Well, my name is Chris, and I have the privilege of serving as lead pastor at a church called BT Church in McAllen, Texas. If you've never been there, go to Mexico, turn left, and you'll find us on the other side of the border. And so I'm in the Rio Grande Valley. I'm a native of South Texas, and I've been in ministry for 22 years. I know you're like, that's impossible. You couldn't have started when you were 10. A prophet called at a young age. No, I'm 44, turned 44 this past week, and I've been serving as the lead pastor at BT for the past 9 years, and it's just reports from South Texas. You may watch the news channel, the news flavor of your choice, and hear about border crisis and immigration. Those are all real things, but I just want you to know that revival is breaking out in South Texas. And we're seeing hundreds of people come to faith in Jesus, and everything related to border crisis and immigration, those things got to be dealt with, but not by me. I'm not a politician, I'm a pastor, and my job is to proclaim the excellencies of Jesus and the grace available by him to anyone who would call upon his name. And so I love serving the local church. I believe the local church is God's primary method of changing the world. And so it just blows my mind that God would let me do what I get to do. I've been married to my wife, Christy. You heard that correctly. It is Chris and Christy, and that's really cute, I know. So we've been married for 21 years, and we have 4 kids. There's a picture of my family behind me, and we are blessed beyond measure. We have our 4 kids. Noah is 16. He's a sophomore in high school. Our daughter, Kana, is 15. She's a freshman. And then our third born, Judah, is 12 years old in 6th grade. And then our youngest son, the wild man, Luke, is 10. And he is in 4th grade. I have a whole sermon about my youngest son that I don't have time to preach because I have this thing called the condemnation clock telling me how long I'm going. And so, but I'll just tell you this, Luke's an amazing story. We were told when he was in the womb that he would never walk. And through the faithfulness of God, he just started taking tennis lessons this past week. And he runs everywhere he goes. So the short version is God in his grace chose to heal our son. And as amazing as that is, the most powerful part of the testimony of Luke is not that he was physically healed, but that his neurosurgeon was eternally healed, because the case of our son being unexplainable gave me the opportunity to present Jesus, and he said yes. So that's a little bit about my story. I've been talking about the theme of Jubilee all weekend, and Jubilee is an interesting word that we don't use a lot in society anymore. Some of you maybe are familiar with the Bible and know that Jubilee shows up there. Maybe some of you are already waiting for lunch and you're thinking of Cherry's Jubilee. I'm not talking about that version today. But in the Bible, we see this concept of the year of Jubilee, and it would happen every 7th year or every collection of 7 years. And during the year of Jubilee, the land would not be worked, and land would go back to previous owners, and slaves would be set free, and all these things would happen. But at the end of the day, what you need to know is that Jubilee biblically is a season of celebration. That's what it is. It's a season of celebration. And what I've been telling your students is this, is that when Jesus gets our yes, when we receive him by grace through faith, and then we keep following him in surrender, the season of celebration, see, seasons by definition have an end, right? Except for summer in McAllen. That bad boy never ends. It's hot all the time. But by definition, seasons end. But when you follow Jesus, that season of celebration actually becomes your whole life. Your life is marked by the favor of God, and you get to live a life worth celebrating and a life to be celebrated. And one of the things that I'm convinced of is, as the people of God, we should not gather on a Sunday morning, and we may have had things happen during the week that were difficult and frustrating, but we should not gather on Sunday morning and sing praises to the Most High and do so with a frown on our face and a chip on our shoulder, guys. We should be the most celebratory people on the planet because we have the best news on the planet. And so I want to wrap up our time today by talking for a few minutes about the concept of Jubilee one more time. And I want to talk about, how do we as the people of God practice Jubilee? How do we practice living a life that demonstrates joy and meaning and purpose? How do we demonstrate a life? How do we practice a life that demonstrates that we've been marked by God? And so for just a few minutes, for a few moments, I want to take you to the book of Exodus. If you have your Bible, maybe digital or physical, you can meet me there. As you turn there, I am sure there are several that are watching with us online. And if that's you, I just want to say thanks for tuning in wherever you are today. The assignment I believe the Lord's given me today is somewhat challenging, and my desire is I'm going to preach the entire book of Exodus to you this morning, and I promise we'll be done by 5 p.m. So, hey, I preached the 9:30, and I knew I had to be done in time for this one, but there's not like a 1:30, right, guy? I mean, so I got all day, so I'm joking. I would never do that. The latest we'll be here is 4, I'm sure, so. Now, I want to look at the life of Moses, and I'm going to do things a little differently than the way I normally preach. What I want to do is I'm going to start in Exodus chapter 3 and look at a few verses, and then if you want to put a mark, we're actually going to go to the book of Deuteronomy, and we're going to close out looking at Deuteronomy chapters 32 and 34. I love the life of Moses. Moses is one of my favorite characters in the scriptures, and while I'm sure most, if maybe not all of you, have heard the story of Moses, I never want to assume we're all starting from the same place. And so if it's somewhat new to you, just let me fill you in real quick. Moses was born as a Hebrew child at a time when the Egyptians were the world power. And Pharaoh had enslaved the Jewish people and made them a free workforce, but the Jewish population was increasing rapidly, and Pharaoh got nervous that if they realized there's more Israelites than Egyptians, they might kind of stage a coup and try to free themselves. So Pharaoh issued a rule, he issued a law basically saying that any Hebrew, any Israelite male baby that would be born would be executed. Well, Moses' mom couldn't bring herself to execute Moses, and so you may know the story. She placed him in a basket and put him in a river. And I think sometimes we read it and we just think to ourselves, well, what an act of faith. Let me just say this. It was absolutely an act of faith. But faith doesn't have to be void of wisdom, right? She didn't just put him in the river all willy-nilly. She put him next to the bank so he would intentionally, I believe, float along the bank. Just so happens that she would do this the same day that Pharaoh's daughter would be bathing. Pharaoh's daughter would see the basket, would see the baby boy, would see that he is beautiful, would decide to keep him, needed someone to nurse, and then God coincidence, she would find Moses' mom. So Moses' mom would have the opportunity to nurse her son. I believe Moses grew up with an interesting life. He most likely was aware of his Hebrew heritage, but he grew up in the court of Pharaoh. He grew up in the court of Pharaoh, and so he's in some ways not quite Hebrew, and he's not quite Egyptian. And one day after Moses had grown up, he was watching the oppression of his people, and in a fit of rage, he acted rashly, and he took the life of an Egyptian taskmaster. He murdered this Egyptian taskmaster, and the next day, some of his own people, some of the Hebrews would see him, and they would be fighting. He would tell them to stop, and they would say, "Are you going to kill us like you did the Egyptians?" So out of fear, he would run to a place called Midian, and he would spend 40 years tending sheep. In Midian, he would meet his wife, and in Midian, he would become prepared for what God would call him to, and that's where we pick up the story today. In Exodus chapter 3, we read about this well-known story of the burning bush. This is what it says in Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 1. It says, "Meanwhile, Moses was shepherding the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And then the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire within a bush. As Moses looked, he saw that the bush was on fire but was not consumed. So Moses thought, I must go over and look at this remarkable sight. Why isn't the bush burning up? And when the Lord saw that Moses had gone over to look, God called out to him from the bush, Moses, Moses. Here I am, he answered. Do not come closer, he said. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. If you want to write some notes today, I have two points that I want to encourage you with on how we can practice Jubilee. And here's the first thing that you can write down. Jubilee is practiced by paying attention to the presence of God. Jubilee, right? That weird celebration, favor, joy. Jubilee is practiced by paying attention to the presence of God. What usually gets talked about in the Exodus 3 story is the burning bush, and it rightly should be. The fact that a bush would be on fire but yet would not be burning is noteworthy. But what I think gets missed sometime is this. Notice that God does not speak to Moses until Moses turns aside and looks. He's out in Midian doing his job, and he notices a bush on fire, not burning. Now, granted, that's pretty noteworthy, right? But the text literally says that he turned aside and then God called out to him. And this is what I would challenge you with today, beloved, that we go through our days so many times and we miss burning bushes. We live at a frenetic, breakneck speed. We live our lives at warp speed, and I'm convinced you can only live your life at warp speed before you warp your soul. And we've adopted this pace of life. Listen, I've always been pretty type A, kind of a hard charger, and I've always ran pretty hard in ministry. What I was not prepared for was the day that I'm living in now, and all you parents that have raised your kids, you're gonna laugh at me. That's rude, don't do it. But I wasn't prepared for the day that my life outside of work would be busier than my life inside of work. That football practice and basketball practice and track meet and choir concert and this and that and church even. I mean, I'm an Uber who doesn't get paid. And I find myself realizing that this life we live is crazy. But that's not news to you, right? And the truth is, it's a good life. I love the life I live with my kids and my wife and the ministry that I get to lead. But guess what's not gonna happen? I'm not gonna get a 25th hour in the day. And we have adopted this honey dip lie that we tell each other that, I know that I should make church more of a commitment. And we pop in, on maybe once or twice a month, maybe. We got the kids select schedules, or I know I should make it on Wednesday nights, but this is going on. I know I should read my Bible more. I know I should do these things, but here's the honey dip lie. I just don't have time. You know why that's a lie? Because we do have time. We just don't make the time for it. And what I want you to hear today, beloved, is this, is that God has more for you than you could ever imagine. I don't care if you're a student that got saved this weekend or you've been walking with the Lord for 50 years. There's more. But that jubilee, right? God does not want us to just get by. John chapter 10, verse 10, Jesus says the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. But I came that you may have life and have it to the fullest, have it in abundance. But that life is only realized when we practice paying attention to the presence of God. My question is, are you practicing that? And all the things that are pulling on you, are you practicing paying attention to the presence of God? Because if you'll just take this 1 week and tell yourself, starting in the morning, I'm gonna spend a few minutes in prayer, right? I'm gonna spend just a few minutes in prayer, and I'm gonna read just a few verses. And listen, I think sometimes as preachers, we say read the Bible, and we don't always do a good job of making that practical. Listen, if you're not currently in the Word of God, here's what you could do this week. The next 5 days, read the first 5 Psalms. Read one a day. Take you 5 minutes at most. Just read it. Make a few notes. Pray about it. But this is my contention. If you will begin to practice paying attention to God, you'll be surprised all the places that you see Him. He's gonna show up all over the place. He's gonna show up at school, he's gonna show up at practice, he's gonna show up at work, he's gonna show up in the neighborhood, he's gonna show up at your friend's house. If we will begin to be a people that practice paying attention to the presence of God, we will be blown away at all the places that we find it. And so to live a life of jubilee, of joy, of celebration, we've got to be people marked by the presence of God. But now if you'll turn to Deuteronomy chapter 32, I'll want to close out with this second point. And the second point is this, is that the Jubilee is practiced by finding God's promise in his presence. Jubilee is practiced by finding God's promise in his presence. This is what the text says in Deuteronomy chapter 32, starting in verse 48. On the same day the Lord spoke to Moses, go up Mount Nebo in the Abarim range in the land of Moab, across from Jericho, and view the land of Canaan I am giving the Israelites as a possession. And then you will die on the mountain that you go up, and you will be gathered to your people, just as your brother Aaron died on Mount Or, and was gathered to his people. For both of you broke faith with me among the Israelites at the waters of Meribah Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin by failing to treat me as holy in their presence. Although from a distance you will view the land that I am giving the Israelites, you will not go there. And then if you'll turn to Deuteronomy 34, it says this. And then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo to the top of Pisgah, which faces Jericho, and the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead as far as Dan, all of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev and the plain in the valley of Jericho and the city of palms as far as Zor. The Lord then said to him, this is the land I promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you will not cross into it. And so Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the Lord's word. He buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, facing Beth Peor. And no one to this day knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not weak, and his vitality had not left him. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plain of Moab for 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses came to an end. Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. No prophet has arisen again in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unparalleled for all the signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do against the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials, to all his land, and for all the mighty acts of power, the terrifying deeds that Moses performed in the sight of all of Israel. And so practicing Jubilee is finding God's promise in his presence. And let me just share briefly with you a few things. There's a part of the story of Moses that I've always struggled with. So Moses, he would argue with God about going to free the Israelites, but he would end up winning, God would end up winning, and Moses would go and he would lead the people out of slavery, and he would lead them to the wilderness, and just like the text says, signs and wonders. I mean, they crossed the Red Sea on dry land, and water came out of the rock, and manna and quail, and just all these miraculous signs. And if you've read the story, what you know to be true is that the Israelites weren't the easiest people to lead. I mean, they get to the banks of the Red Sea. They've been enslaved for 400 years. They get to the banks of the Red Sea. Now, granted, this is a problem. Behind them, the Egyptian army is pursuing them, and in front of them is an immovable object, the Red Sea, right? They're gonna get slaughtered or drowned. But God has led them out, and they start telling Moses, Moses, why did you lead us out here to die? They basically say, we didn't even want to leave. Like, Moses is a much better person than I am. I'd have been like, false. You're lying, because I was fine in Midian, and then God told me he heard you crying about things. I'm actually here because of you. The waters would part, but then they get hungry, and so God brings manna, and then they're like, oh, we're tired of manna, which I'm convinced was chips and salsa, by the way, but anyways. And like, oh, we want meat, so God brings quail. I mean, they're just, the Bible says they're stiff-necked people. Like, they're just complainers. Now listen, I already talked to Gary about this. We are glad that church folk aren't that way anymore, right, brother? I mean, no one in church complains anymore. There's no stiff-necked people. I can say that because in about 4 hours, I'm getting on an airplane and going home, and then Trace can clean up the mess. So, no, Other church, not this church, other churches have stiff-necked people, not y'all. But what happens is Moses would meet with God one time. This is in Numbers chapter 20. You don't have to turn there. But Moses would meet with God, and God would tell Moses to go speak to a rock, and water would come out of it. And so Moses comes out of this thing called the tent of meeting, and he goes up to the rock, but instead of speaking, he strikes it. He hits it twice. Pop, pop, right? He's mad. He's mad at the people. He calls them rebels. He's like, you rebellious people. And so he strikes the rock, and water comes out of it like God said would happen. But God said, speak to it. So when Moses and God confer on things, God tells Moses, here's the deal, man. You broke faithfulness and fellowship with me. I said, speak to it, and you struck it. So you and Aaron and these people, you are not going to the promised land. Now, let me just be transparent, because listen, I know you think I'm perfect, but I've made like 2 sins in my life. And no, I'm far from perfect. And so I've always kind of struggled with the consequences. This is me. Like, God has put up with the people of Israel. I mean, they melted gold, right? You know the story? They melted gold and made a calf and worshiped it. The gold they got from Egypt when they left town. I mean, I get why they're not going to the promised land. But Moses? I mean, it's Mo. I mean, come on. How are you not going to let him in? And this is something that I just find perplexing, because one thing that I know to be true about Moses is Moses in the book of Exodus demonstrates both a proficiency and a proclivity to argue with God. Right? I know we get uncomfortable when the preacher talks about people in the Bible not being perfect, but they're not. In Exodus 3, when God speaks to Moses through the burning bush, if we kept reading in the story, we will find Moses argue with God and give 5 reasons why Moses isn't the man for the job. He says, I'm not good enough. I don't have the answers. No one will believe me. I don't speak well. I'm not qualified. In fact, at the end of these 5 excuses, the text says that the Lord's anger burned towards Moses, but he didn't give up on him. If you kept reading, you get to Exodus chapter 32 and 33, and after the whole golden calf incident, God tells Moses, I'm done with these guys. Like, I am wiping them out. And Moses, he argues. Like, I know we want to clean it up. He didn't argue, Chris. He pleaded with the Lord. Guys, I got 4 kids. They plead with me all the time. You know what my wife and I call it? Arguing. And so God says, I'm done. And Moses, no. And God says, fine. You and I are good, but I'm done with them. No. Fine, I will get them to the promised land. I will send an angel to wipe out all your enemies, but I am not going with you guys. And Moses would say, no, if you don't go with us, we don't go. How will we be distinguished as your people? And we read the story, by the way, this is just a side note of a theology lesson. We read the story and the Bible says that the Lord relented. And we maybe hear it said that God changed his mind, and maybe you wrestle with that because, man, how did Moses change God's mind? And can we change God's mind? I don't have time for this, but let me just tell you, beloved, Moses didn't change God's mind. God changed Moses to be the man he needed him to be. There is no shadow of turning with God. He is unchangeable. But he will speak to us in a relational way to get us where he needs us to be. So all I'm saying is this: Moses demonstrates in the biblical text that he was willing to argue with God. And so here in Deuteronomy 32, when God reminds him, he's 120 years old, but Deuteronomy 34 says that his eyes weren't weak and he wasn't frail. I mean, the dude climbed a mountain, for crying out loud, right? I don't think he's on death's door yet. But in Deuteronomy 32, God says you're gonna go up Nebo, you're going to see the land of promise, and then you will die because you broke faithfulness with me. I just think that it would make sense for the next part of scripture to be Moses's final argument, right? Like, okay, God, listen, I remember the whole rock thing. I know, I hit it, you said speak to it. A little bit of time has passed, and I really think we should talk about this. Like I know I'm 120, but I still see pretty well, don't have glasses, never had LASIK. I mean, I can get around. I've got some good years left in me. And so, Lord, what if I did go to the promised land? And let me just say this, for Moses, the promised land wasn't inconsequential. This is the land promised to Father Abraham, right? This meant something. And so I've just been curious, why maybe in this moment is there no pushback? Now, let me just be clear. Moses was disobedient and he broke the command of the Lord. And disobedience brings consequences. But I think sometimes we zero in on that and we might miss something really powerful. Because if you remember, the point is this, that the practice of Jubilee is realized when we find the promise of God in the presence of God. Catch that? That the practice of Jubilee is a reality when we find God's promises in his presence. And so how does Moses get to the end of his life and arguably the penultimate, the greatest thing for him as a Hebrew prophet would have been to go to the promised land? How does he get there still full of life and not even offer up an argument? And my contention is this. I believe somewhere along the way, I believe somewhere in the tent of meeting where he met with God face to face as one friend meets with another, I believe in his time with the Lord, I believe something radical changed in Moses. To go from the burning bush and giving 5 arguments why he shouldn't be used to faithfully walk up the mountain to take his last breath with no challenge. I believe in the time that passed, something powerful changed. And this is what I would tell you that I believe it is. I believe somewhere in Moses' life, the promised land became the presence of God. That somewhere in his journey, somewhere in his walking with the Lord, his fellowship with the Lord, the promised land was no longer a place. It wasn't a destination, it was a person. And when the Lord would speak to Moses on Mount Nebo and he would say, listen, you broke faithfulness, it happened, there's consequences. But I don't actually view this, it was a consequence, yes, but I view this as the continued favor of God because he would say to Moses, and so you will see the land, you will not go, and then you will be gathered to your people. Hebrew concept, presence of God is what it means. And Moses would not offer argument because perhaps his culture and his history would say the promised land is the greatest thing. His knowledge would say it's God. And so he was content to take his last breath on Mount Nebo because I think Moses was more concerned in staying in the presence of God than going to a promised land without him. And my question today is, do we live the same way? There are promises of God for you in Scripture. There are promises of God for you and for me. His promise to never leave us or forsake us. His promise to meet all of our needs according to his riches and glory. His promise to give us life to the full. His promise to do above and beyond all we could ask or think, exceedingly abundantly more. Ephesians 3:20 and 21. There are promises in Scripture for you and for I, but the promises are found in his presence. And beloved, we live in a crazy world. And we get caught up in it. Let's be honest. We wonder who's going to fill the White House next, and that's going to be the answer to our problems. Who's going to get elected in Congress? Who's going to be the state rep? Who's going to be the local official? How's my 401k doing? Can't do any worse than last year, right? And these things aren't necessarily inherently evil, but we start looking to temporary solutions in a temporary world when we've got the eternal presence of God available to all of us who have called upon his name. And my question is, do we capitalize on what we've been given? Listen, every election cycle, I encourage you to vote according to the Scripture. By the way, you can only do that if you know the Scripture. But it doesn't matter who the rep, the senator, or the president is, the king stays the same. And it's his presence that changes everything. He's not far off. He's not hidden. He's right here. And whether you've created the habit of seeking him or not, he'll meet you today. He'll meet you today. Today you can say, Lord, I just want to come back. I just want to rest in your presence. Students are about to get baptized. You can say, I want to take the next faithful step. Maybe I want to talk about getting baptized one Sunday. Maybe there's someone, and the truth is, maybe you've been in church a lot. But you know what's interesting? Despite lots of belief systems trying to rewrite the script, what the Bible teaches us is that religious activity isn't the answer. Relational identity is. And so I leave you with this. Do you know that you know Jesus today? Have you had a moment where his presence became the promise? Because as Paul would write to the church at Rome in Romans 10:9, if you would believe in your heart, confess with your mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord and God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. You say, it can't be that easy. Never mistake the gift of grace as cheap, because Jesus gave his life for it. And you may have all kinds of stuff in your past. And you may think you got to talk to a pastor. Listen, Chris, I need to come to church a little more. I got to clean things up before I can come to Jesus because I have some mess. I'll just tell you this. I said it to the students this weekend. You may be a really good sinner. The Apostle Paul said he was the chief of sinners. I think I give him a run for his money personally. You may be a really, really good sinner, but he's still a much better Savior. And so I'm going to pray and you'll be given some instructions, but today maybe for just a moment you would like to respond. I want you to know this time is for you, and if you would like to talk to someone about what it means to know Jesus, I know that there's going to be people available. Let's pray together. Father, I'm thankful for our time today. I'm thankful to worship and singing. I'm thankful to worship in the Word. And God, I pray that you would just speak to hearts in this moment. God, I pray for those that maybe years ago said yes to the gift of grace and received life in Christ, but the truth is they've not been seeking the presence, and that God, you would remind them today you haven't gone anywhere. Your arms are open to welcome them back. God, I pray we'd be people of discipline, that we would choose to seek you first in your kingdom. God, I pray for steps of faithfulness and steps of obedience. God, I pray we would capitalize and use this time to believe that maybe you have something for us. And Father, I pray for anyone today in this room hearing my voice that does not know Jesus, that today would be the day of salvation, that they would go from death to life and believe that the promise of God is enough. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.